The Seventh Tower by Garth Nix. Book 1, The Fall. Chapter 2. Tal sat by his mother for a long time, thinking of how he could get a new, powerful sunstone. He could think of only 3 ways, and all carried some risk. The first would be to ask his mother's cousins, Lalic and Korik. They were higher up in the Orange Order, rumored to be going yellow soon. They both wore several sunstones, in their silver circlets, in the rings that flashed upon their fingers, even set in the points of their mirror-bright shoes. Tal thought they must have won them gambling. He'd never seen Lalic or Korik do anything else. But Lalic and Korik were not known for their generosity, and Tal thought that they particularly disliked him. He couldn't understand why, though when he was younger he had set up a bucket of ash to fall on them, dulling their brilliance just before a family dinner. It had only been a joke, but they seemed to hold a grudge. Of course, it hadn't just been ash. Still, Tal thought, they were family, and they were just outside in their reception room, though that was probably only because everyone would expect them to come, now that the news was out about Riram's presumed death. Tal sighed. His shadow guard, catching his mood, changed shape from a 2-headed Corvile to an almost normal shadow. It shivered, and made a sort of throwing-up motion, before slipping back into the long, cat-like shape of a Corvile, though with only 1 head. It made Tal smile. Even his shadow guard disliked Lalic and Korik. This time, Tal stopped at the door and made the proper bow to his elders. He raised his sunstone and said, "I greet you, Korik, Lalic, and Shadow Master Sushin," said the unknown man, negligently raising his own sunstone and rudely blasting a very bright white light into Tal's face. Korik and Lalic did the same, so Tal had to raise his hand to shield his eyes. The light grew brighter still, and Tal felt an unpleasant heat on his hand. His shadow guard let out a low whistle, so low that only Tal could hear. Tal felt anger building inside him, as hot and bright as the light. His cousins and this unknown Shadow Master, a title that meant he served the Empress directly, in addition to his rank in the Orange Order, would never have dared treat him like this if his mother or father were around. The light disappeared, and Tal brought his hand down. None of the 3 had bothered to get up, but their spirit shadows had moved forward and were standing over Tal, unpleasantly close. The Shadow Master's, Tal realized, was a deep-water shell beast. It had a flat shell or carapace that covered its middle. "The Shadow Master was not impressed by your rudeness," said Lalic. "Even under the circumstances, one must not forget the proper way to do things." "I beg the Shadow Master's forgiveness," Tal said slowly, forcing the words out. "May my light diminish no further in his eyes." The Shadow Master grunted. He looked like a pig, Tal thought. He had a fat face, ready to grub at any trough, like the pigs the underfolk herded in the farm caverns far below. "Take 3 deluminants," said the Shadow Master, picking 4 clear bracelets out of his sleeve pocket and throwing them to Tal. They landed on the ground, since Tal was too shocked to catch them. He bent to pick them up, slowly slipping each one over his hand onto his wrist. Deluminants were visible punishments, marking an offense against the Order or the Empress. They could only be removed by someone higher than the person who'd given them in the first place. If Tal picked up 7 deluminants, he would be demoted to the Red Order. 7 more after that, and he would be joining the Underfolk, even before the day of Ascension. After putting on the 3rd bracelet, Tal stopped and looked at the Shadow Master. 3 deluminants was a ridiculously harsh punishment for not greeting his superiors properly, but the Shadow Master had thrown 4. "There are 4 deluminants, Shadow Master," he said, feeling his face flush with the humiliation. He had never had more than a single deluminant in his life. 3, 4, it doesn't matter," said the Shadow Master. "Put it on, Tal. You must learn to pay proper respect." Slowly, Tal picked up the 4th deluminant and slid it onto his wrist. The bracelets were made of crystal and jangled as they touched. "How can I serve my distinguished visitors?" Tal asked, following the proper ritual, even though he wanted to pick up a jug of frosted sweet water and throw it in their faces. "I am the Shadow Master Sushin, Bright Star of the Orange Order and Spectral Adept," announced the fat man. "I have come to offer the Empress's sorrow at the death of your father." "He's not dead," Tal wanted to say, but he did not dare speak aloud. This Shadow Master seemed to want him to be disrespectful. He was even reaching into his sleeve pocket to jangle the deluminants there while he watched Tal struggle with his feelings. "We thank the Empress," said Tal. He didn't really understand what was going on. Why was this Shadow Master so hostile to him? He expected his cousins to be nasty, but this man was a stranger, a servant of the Empress. "That's it, really," said Sushin. He took a handful of dried shrimps out of his voluminous pocket and stuffed them into his mouth, still talking. "You may go back to the lectorium now, Tal. Must keep up with your studies." Tal felt sick, watching the huge wad of pink munched-up shrimps churning about in Sushin's mouth. The man was a pig and a bully. Shrimps were his mother's favorite, and hard to come by, since they were rarely trapped in the deep underground streams by the Underfolk. Tal had been trying to get her some for weeks, without success. "I desire to ask a question of my mother's cousins, if I may," Tal said carefully. Despite the anger he felt at having to ask permission to speak in his own home, he had no choice. "Ask away," replied Sushin. He took another handful of shrimps and washed them down with a glass of sweet water, spilling it down the deep furrows where his bloated cheeks met his mouth. "Light shine on you, Shadow Master," said Tal, bowing again. He turned to his cousins, who were smiling, but not in a nice way. They seemed to be looking forward to something. Their spirit shadows jiggled in front of Tal, almost dancing, so he had to talk between them. "Mother is ill," he began, "and since Father is missing, we will need help to enter Einar when the day of ascension comes. I ask your help. As close cousins to my mother, grant us a sunstone of sufficient power to be a primary sunstone." Lalik and Korik looked at each other, and their smiles grew wider. Then they looked at Sushin, and everyone smiled, except Tal. "Oh no," said Lalik, fingering the two very large sunstones that flashed on her thumb and forefinger rings. "We really haven't any to spare." "What a shame," added Korik, lightly touching the pendant she wore that held 4 sunstones, all of them twice as large as Tal's own. "But I'm sure you'll manage somehow, even though your father is dead." Tal stared at them, his fury growing. Dimly he was aware of his shadow guard gripping him about the knees so he wouldn't charge forward. He gripped his own sunstone, wishing that he could throw light spears from it, or the rain of sparks, or any of the other combat magic that he had only just begun to learn in the lectorium. Sushin broke the tension by shoveling the last of the shrimps into his mouth and pushing himself up out of the chair. Lalik and Korik hastily jumped up as well. By rights, all 3 should have bowed to Tal as they were in his house, but they didn't. Sushin just walked out, followed by the 2 women. The spirit shadows backed away slowly. They knew, even if their masters did not, that Tal was very close to some sort of crazy attack. When the Underfolk servant closed the door behind them, the shadow guard let Tal go. His breathing started to work again, and he could think. His first plan to get a sunstone had failed miserably. He would have to move on to the next plan. And he would have to try to find out why Shadow Master Sushin wanted him to fail. "You'll see," Tal whispered to the door. He raised his arm and jangled the deluminants. "You'll see. I'll get my sunstone." His shadow guard grew an arm and shook it too, in silent protest. It kept on after Tal stopped, and had to race to catch up with him as he went to see how Gref and Kusi were coping with the terrible news.